Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today, we're looking into the realm of visual effects. Our guest has a large credit list, including the Batman, many Planet of the Apes movies, King Kong, and Avatar. We're pleased to welcome Dan Lemmon. Dan, thank you for doing this all the way from New Zealand.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
It's such a pleasure. I'm a huge fan of your podcast and obviously a huge fan of your film work as well. So it's a real treat to be able to join you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we'd like to start with our normal question, which is, how did you get to where you are today? I always wonder if visual effects kids were trying to animate inanimate objects throughout their childhood. Did you grow up in New Zealand? What's your story?
No, I grew up in America. I was born on the East Coast of Massachusetts, and then my parents met in college, and so they met at BYU in Utah. So I lived in Salt Lake City for probably the first 11 years of my life. And it was interesting, like at that time, my parents had kind of followed this idealistic track where my father had studied chemistry in college, but then had decided that it wasn't for him. He changed his major. He got into youth development and recreation. So his job when I was born was he took troubled kids on camping trips, as part of like the probation, the youth probation team, and would basically try to help the kids through giving them other experiences to follow the straight and narrow. And I think at a certain point, he realized that it wasn't really working, and he wasn't able to support the family the way that he wanted to as well. And so he went back to business school, and he got a business degree, and then we moved out to California. And it was kind of like when I was young, because we didn't have much money, like going to the movies was a real treat. It was often my grandparents, when they'd come into town, they'd take me to movies. So I saw E.T. with them. I saw Return of the Jedi. And, the films like that had a big impact on me when I was younger. I was in classic films, but also I was just so fascinated by the creatures, by the characters that, and like just wanted to know how they made them work. Like E.T. was such, even though he was a little rubber puppet, to me, when I saw that film, I just connected with him like in a very emotional kind of way. And so trying to figure out how to replicate that myself, I was really fascinated. My grandfather had like an old, I guess it was a high 8, like the video camera that took the sort of cassette-sized cassettes, and it had a function where you could push the start and stop button really quickly, and you'd get about like 3 frames in a single burst. And so I would take Legos and other things and just do little like stop motion animations, little stories, and I'd spend like days putting these little stories together, and like. It was super crude, but the idea that you could take models or take something that you had kind of put together and then bring it to life in a movie, that to me was just like super compelling and really interesting. So when we moved to California, it was interesting. Like I started to meet some of my friends. Their parents worked in the business, and suddenly the idea of a job in movies went from something that seemed kind of impossible to suddenly like there are actually people in the neighborhood who did those kind of things. So that was that kind of opened my eyes to that as a maybe a career path. And about the time I got into high school, There are two movies that came out that had like a really kind of outsized influence on me. At the time, I was like, oh, I would really love to do animatronic films, like to do, some of the work that Stan Winston was doing, and some of the makeup work as well. The like Greystoke and the early Planet of the Apes films were, they to me were like seemed like, and obviously Star Wars as well. Star Wars was a huge one, but the characters that they were creating just seemed so cool. So, I would read all the magazines, the Fangoria and Cinefex. I started getting copies of Cinefex and just reading behind the scenes how these people created these amazing characters. And then Terminator 2 came out, and that to me was kind of a mind blower, because suddenly just the realism of the characters went up a huge notch. The liquid metal T-1000 and the what they were able to do with this new computer technology, it was fascinating. And then I think the next year Jurassic Park came out, and that to me was the one that just really kind of, I guess, oriented my goals in terms of seeing a path to, like, seeing a tool that was able to just create images that had never been seen to that degree of realism before, and was able to advance the kind of the narrative and the spectacle of the film in a way that was just not the same, prior to that technological leap. And so I was like, okay, I really want to do that. And I went back to my magazines and kind of studied like what the pathway was that some of these people took to get into that kind of work. And at the time, you couldn't study that stuff in school, really. A lot of those guys were either former architects or product designers, or, from sort of parallel skill sets. Like, they had this kind of combination of, strong creative skills, but then also strong technical skills. There was many of them had a kind of engineering background, or, some kind of technical expertise as well as creative. And so I kind of set my sights on doing something like that in school, and I ended up studying product design. And that, at the time, some of the software had some overlap. So, to me, it seemed like a way to be able to get a degree and learn some of the skills, and be able to maybe be, useful or marketable in that world. But one of the things that, you did in the design programs was you took all these foundation classes. And at the time, I was like, they seemed a little bit like not a waste of time, but they just seemed like a lot of busy work, like it was like, we had these composition classes where it was like 2D composition, and all you were allowed to do really was to cut shapes out of paper and put them on another piece of paper and try to make an interesting, image out of that. And it's funny, like with so many of the courses that I took in university, the ones that seemed the least useful ended up being the most useful to me in the long run. So this course where you're literally cutting pieces of paper up and putting them into, some kind of compelling image, those kind of fundamentals of design and composition, it really laid the foundation for what what would later, would use to create shots and to create images and designs that would have a focus, that would lead your eye, that would kind of stand on their own as something interesting to look at. And it's like, there was one course I took that was it was the history of design and architecture, and my classmates called it the chair class, because it seemed like a lot of what you were studying was the history of chairs, and it seemed just kind of utterly pointless at the first glance. But I learned so much from that class about the history of design, and something so abstract, simple as a chair, and how many different ways an artist and a craftsman could approach that problem of what is it like to sit down, and what is the optimal vessel for receiving a body and putting it in the optimal position to do a job or to relax or whatever. And that it just ended up being a really rich education for all the reasons that I didn't expect. As I was doing that, I'd work, or I'd do my kind of couple semesters of work, and then during the summer, I would go back to California and back to Los Angeles, and I started looking for internships, and I managed to get an internship. The year after my first year at university, I got an internship at Cinesite in Hollywood, back when it was kind of owned and run by Kodak. And they let me come in and answer their phones, organize their film vault. They let me do be the projectionist when the projectionist was busy doing other things. And so I would, one of the things I got to do was go pick up dailies in the morning. And I pick up the dailies. I'd get one of the old tape splicers together, and I would cut the dailies together, try to make sure that I didn't mess up and get a perf wrong or something, so when I project it would be out of alignment. And that kind of mechanical process of assembling the reel, rewinding it by hand on the spool, loading up the projector, and then showing, these visual effects experts in the projection room, we'd play it. They'd say, okay, rewind it. Okay, stop there. It was all verbal at that point. It wasn't really a slick way of going back and forth. But I felt like I'd just gone to heaven. Like I was like getting a peek behind the curtain about like being able to see how these people were creating characters for these movies and the process of like going from kind of nothing to something. And then they would let me train on the software at night. So I'd kind of, work during the day, stay at night and train on the software. And then I managed to get another internship at the same time in Santa Barbara, which is, of course, a 3-hour drive away from Hollywood. But they let me come in 3 nights a week. I worked at a company called Wavefront Technologies that eventually became Alias Wavefront, that eventually wrote the software Maya that a lot of us visual effects artists use now. And they just come out with a new piece of software, and they needed some people to kind of test drive the documentation. So I would drive, 3 nights a week. I'd get off work at like 6 or 7, and then I'd drive up to Santa Barbara and say hello to the security guard, go into the room and test the tutorials and train up on their software as well. So it was, it didn't make for a lot of sleep, but it was just a really, I felt like it was the coolest thing ever. I was so excited to do that. I think the following summer, I ended up getting a internship at Digital Domain in Venice Beach. They were just getting started on, I think they just finished Apollo 13 when I started my first day there. So I got to go to dailies. They had the music playing as the last shots were showing on the projector. They were kind of getting the last finals for the rocket launch. And that, again, was just like, for me at the time, it just felt like the most exciting moment, like to be able to walk in on my first day and see these just beautiful shots in the screening room. And here, I think it was Rob Legato who was the visual effects supervisor in that one, and he, was approving the finals. They had the champagne out. It just looked like the coolest party. And I did an internship that summer. I came back the next summer. I worked on The Fifth Element. I came back the summer after that, and I worked on Titanic, all as an intern. And I got to go from being sort of like, I guess, a little bit of a gopher to actually working on the box and doing some of the actual work. And that was kind of my way in. And by virtue of those internships, when I graduated, I was able to get a permanent job. And I worked at Digital Domain for a number of years. And then it would have been 2002, I moved out to New Zealand to work on the Lord of the Rings movies. And what I thought was going to be...
the rest is history.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was going to be an 18-month kind of short-term gig, and, 25 years later, I'm still here.
So there was a real difference in what was possible, it seems like, in The Fifth Element and Titanic, because we saw parts of The Fifth Element the other day, and there seems to be a real jump up in the technology between those two films. Is that right?
Yeah, it was, I think, in those days, things just got so much better so quickly, and new tools were coming online, and what was really hard one year suddenly became much more feasible, the next year. There are things like, water simulation was a thing that was like quite difficult and very specialized, and something that, grew from something that was quite expensive and quite hard and became, like in Titanic, of course, we did, there was quite a lot of it, and it's only gotten, better and easier to use since. And, we went through fads as well, like as the technology became available, it became quite popular, and then maybe got a little overused, and then settled into a tool that would be maybe not, it's just another tool in the box that you would break out for its appropriate purpose, but not necessarily build a whole sequence around. But Fifth Element was really cool. In the day, we had these sound stages attached to the kind of production facility of Digital Domain. So it was an old dairy, I believe, and then it was used by advertising, as a production space. And then when I was there with Digital Domain, these sound stages ended up being mostly used for miniature shoots. And again, I was an intern and walking the stages there with massive. It seems silly to call them miniatures. They basically had future Manhattan, sitting there on the concrete floor, and you're walking through, and you feel like Godzilla just striding through, and they're just some of the camera tricks that they would use for doing some of the shots, and they had all the motion control cameras that for the most part you had to, at that time, each facility was sort of had their own engineers that were building and altering them and keeping them running and programming moves, and yeah, it was just super cool. But it's funny, you look back and you can see how far the technologies come each year. So yeah, from Fifth Element to Titanic, certainly big jumps, and also just how different filmmakers would use the tools too. And that's, I think, one of the big things was that some filmmakers they'd embrace a particular tool for their narrative, and some projects didn't. Wouldn't be. I remember we did a few tests for James Cameron after Titanic, and I think with an eye towards looking at making the Avatar movies, and he, I think everybody determined that the technology just wasn't ready yet, and it wasn't for several years before the creature animation pipelines and tools were up to the point where we could take on a project like that.
You said that at that point, technology was changing so quickly and constantly. Is that not true now?
No,
it doesn't change as quickly?
That definitely is true. I mean, I guess it's funny. I hesitate to answer that question definitively, because on the one hand, there are massive leaps being made, right now in a lot of different areas. But I also feel like in the earlier days, it felt like everything was just a lot harder. You had to work a lot harder with the tools just to get things to look passable, to look plausible. And as the computers have gotten faster, I mean, the speed of the computers helps a lot, because suddenly things that were prohibitively expensive, in terms of the amount of time that it would take for a processor to execute, now are thousands of times faster. So you can do things. You can use ray tracing tools that would have been too expensive in the past, and it just makes the realism that much easier to achieve from the outset. And so a lot of what we would be really laboring to do in the earlier days, we almost take for granted now. Things like cloth solves and water solves and some of those kind of technical simulation. It's not that they, and especially flesh, muscles and skin and that kind of thing. It took many years before that stuff became fast and actually usable to the point where now it's you see a lot of great work coming out of many kind of medium-sized facilities that wouldn't have the ability to have the team of engineers to be dedicated to creating those kind of tools. Now they're available off the shelf, and there's many people that are very good at using them, and so it's not quite as hard as it was in that kind of I guess the bread and butter things. But that's not to say that the technology is slowed down in its advancement. There's, of course, with many of the generative AI tools that a lot of controversy around them, but let's just call it machine learning based tools. There is a lot of advancement that's happened, even just in the last year or two, and things that were labor intensive, extremely labor intensive, 3 or 4 years ago, suddenly are much less so, or the way that you approach them is a little different, and you can achieve a realistic result a lot more readily than you might have been able to before.
Could you talk about, in particular, but the difference between how you would approach, say, a Fifth Element today and how it was done? You said you walked through all the models and stuff. I mean, models seem to be more or less a thing of the past, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's still really good use cases for models, and it's, that it's interesting because before there used to be more of a difference between, a CG, like we would, I'm trying to think of a good example, but like some movies I've worked on, you'd do like a miniature spaceship, and then you'd also have like a model, spaceship, and then you'd also have a CG version of that spaceship, and you would use them for different places in the movie, different purposes, right? And you would lean more on the miniatures for certain kind of things, and then you'd pick up the CG tool for other types of processes. I think two things have happened. One is that like the CG models have just gotten a lot better. The tools, it's easier to create things realistically. The computers can hold a lot more information, so you can put a lot of little nernies and doodads. Like you can add a lot more detail to those CG models than you used to be able to. And there's a lot of great tools and pipelines that people have developed over the years to do that. But then also like a lot of the motion control tools have gotten easier to use or have become more available as well. And there's still people that really advocate for using miniatures, filmmakers and visual effects artists as well, for certain kinds of looks. You get a particular kind of look from having a physical miniature. And a lot of it has as much to do with just the photography process as it does with the actual object itself, having to put real lights on it, and they have a certain distance, it's not infinite. It's not, so if you're lighting like something that's meant to be in sunlight, like whether you're shooting that on a stage or whether you're shooting it out under a blue sky, like.
And it's also the aberration of the lenses, that you don't always have in CG.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, for me, I always, and this goes not just for miniatures, but just for like, stunt scenes or, car vehicles, like anytime I can shoot something physical and real, I will do that for those reasons, because there are just those anomalies with, whether it's with the lens or with anything else in the imaging system, with filtration, with elements in the air, whether it's atmospheric perspective. There are a lot of things that are very difficult to emulate, that like inside the computer, that a lot of nuance in physical photography that, we go to great lengths to try to emulate it, but it's difficult to get everything. So like on the Batman, for example, Greg Fraser, who was our photographer, and he worked with Arri to develop lenses for what was at the time the new, large format system, the LF. And he asked them to just heavily detune those lenses. So they effectively were intentionally optically compromising a lot of the qualities of those lenses in order to get a particular look that Matt Reeves, our director, had, and Greg had kind of, decided that they wanted to embrace. And it's funny, I talked to Andrew Pryor at Arri, who was doing the lens setups for that. And he had Jake Marcuson, who was the focus puller. They're telling the story of like, as they were working on detuning these lenses, they do some stuff, they shoot some things, they showed it to Greg. Greg would say, okay, yeah, looks good, but push it a little further. Let's get it, mess up the lenses a little bit more. And it got to a point where Andrew was like, I didn't even want to show him. It was just they looked so terrible. He looked at the charts and they were just like, the only thing that was sharp was the very center of the lens, and then everything else just fell off to nothing. And they projected it. And Greg was like, so what is it that you don't like about these lenses? And Andrew, was like, well, like this, it doesn't hold focus. It's only the center sharp. Like, but there's all these problems, and you just look at the charts and you can see it. And Greg said, yeah, you're right. If we were making a movie about lens charts, then this would be the wrong lenses to use. Yeah. But what they do to the actors' faces and to the rest of the scene, it's just it's really incredible. So that we ended up carrying two sets of lenses. We had kind of our master lenses that were Greg's detune lenses, which they used. I would say 90% of the shots, but maybe not quite 90%. So like we ended up carrying two sets of lenses. We had, like, for example, we had an 85 millimeter that was like the Arri, they called it the basically the alpha large format lenses. And the 85 was the pristine, tuned, high quality lens. And then we had the crazy 88, which was like very similar focal length, but like only sharp in the very center of the lens, and then just fell off to just buttery nothingness. And it was really interesting because like the bokeh on the lens, the way that the light would defocus was that effectively if it was in front of the image plane, the bokeh would kind of go more radial, like you get these like streaks out from the center. But if it was behind the focus plane, the out of focus circles would turn into these crescents. They would streak out in a circle kind of around the center of the lens. And it was this very interesting, very kind of bizarre pattern that we would see in these detuned lenses. And for us on the visual effects side, it was very important for us to try to mimic that, to try to create our digital imagery in a way that matched that optical quality. So we had the same kind of bokeh, the same kind of fall off, the same, so that as we put, composite elements in, sure, but also to create CG shots that were going to be intercut with the photography from the film, that it would look consistent and that it would look like it all kind of matches up.
Was it good enough that if you felt you could replicate exactly what the lens was doing optically, does that negate the need to shoot anything that way?
No,
wouldn't you just shoot it clean on another film and then just add those things in post?
No, for me, I would always advocate shooting as much as possible practically, because you think you're emulating everything, but there's no way. You're getting everything that you see, and you're doing your best approximation of everything that you can see. But in a different, lighting scenario, in a different kind of compositional framework, you may end up, there may be other kind of qualities that are present that you didn't detect the first time, and that are rich and interesting, and that you would be missing out on if you didn't have that photographic reference. And like I'm an advocate to the point where I will strongly encourage the team to shoot shots that I know that there won't be a pixel from the photography that will end up in the final shot. I know that I'm going to be replacing everything, but it's so important to have that photographic realism and reference that even though for various reasons, maybe we couldn't get the car to go fast enough, maybe there was so much motion blur or distortion, we were going to have to replace elements anyway. To have that foundation, that starting point, even if we replace everything, it's just really critical in getting a look that is realistic and consistent with the rest of the visual language of the film. And, like I've worked with producers that say like, well, look, if you're just going to use it as reference, then why are we spending money, and time shooting this? Like, it's just reference. You're going to replace it anyway. We should not do this. And it's really like, that was one of the things that is really great about working with, filmmakers that are passionate about the craft and also just smart and understand the utility. And Matt Reeves was a great advocate for that process of like, even if we know it's going to be replaced later, to have that foundation, we can keep going back and referencing it as we're trying to create the digital version of it. And we've got a target that we know lives in the same world as everything else. The other thing,
and you were saying another thing.
Oh, yeah. The other thing that Greg did that I had never seen before, we're shooting out in, what was it? It's East London at an oil refinery. They had some tracks we were racing around in with the Batmobile chase when he was chasing the penguin. And it was raining, and it was one of the first nights out there. And I saw Jake, the focus puller, very carefully taking this filter off the camera package and kind of wiping around the edges of it and putting it back in. But it looked like there was still like a big glob of water, like in the set, like on the filter. I came over and looked closely, and I was like, "Oh, Jake, what do you got there?" And he just laughed. He's like, "This is one of Greg's silicon filters." I was like, "Silicon filter? What is that?" And he's like, "Look over there." And I see Greg Fraser with like, it was like a caulking gun. It was like one of those things that you would seal your bathtub with, squirting like clear, silicon goo onto a plate of glass. And he was like doing little squiggles here, little squiggle there. And he probably had a dozen of these and they were all carefully labeled, A, B, C, D. And he'd call out for, different filters depending on the shot and where we wanted the kind of water blur to be. And they would carefully load them in. And he made them, one night in the middle of the shoot, and then we used them for the rest of the shoot. And it was funny. It looked like a piece of glass that like a glazier had like left on the side and wiped their rag with, And
you know where that comes from. Originally, what cinematographers used to do, they would use a little cotton bud and nose grease, and they would look through the lens and wipe the grease from their nose onto the glass. If they wanted to bloom a street light, or even soften an actress without affecting the rest of the frame, they used to wipe this grease on the glass as they were looking through the camera. I've actually done it myself, so a few times, but that's where that all came from.
I mean, I've certainly seen like, Vaseline on the lens, so to speak, before. This was like taking it to a whole other level. I mean, like the gob of goo on the lens would have been like, a full centimeter off the profile. But it was amazing. Like it would the effect that you got, like, because they would, and then the other thing would be the camera operator, just before they roll, he'd put his hand in a puddle and just flick the water onto the glass just before they roll. So you have this dripping, water, and then this permanent kind of silicone blob. And as the tail lights of the car would rip through the frame, you just get this beautiful constellation of fractured light that would like kind of spill out as it went from one side of the frame to the other. And it was really gorgeous. It was like slightly heart attack inducing for some of the visual effects team. When you're like, all right, like, here's what happened. Here's what we need to replicate digitally. In order for our CG, Batmobile to look like the real Batmobile, we have to create these crazy fractures of light. And here's some pictures of the pieces of glass with the goo on them, and now go get busy and replicate that.
How much time did you have on the Batman to do the visual effects?
I want to say we had about 40 weeks in post. It was something, maybe a little 42 weeks, something like that. It was about right, I guess. You always wish you had more time. You never really want to put the pencils down, but it was, and it's Matt is such a methodical filmmaker as well. He likes to start at the beginning and cut the picture from the opening and just advance through and reel by reel. And unfortunately, because of the compressed time, we had to do some negotiating where the Batmobile chase, the third act at the end of the film, we needed those shots a little earlier so that we could get those complete. So a little bit of back and forth there. But,
How did you just talk about that night chase sequence, which is pretty spectacular? I've seen some behind the scenes stuff, and it actually surprised me how much was computer generated and how the live action and the animated stuff is combined together. It's pretty flawless. Can you talk about the approach to that, or why the certain choices?
Yeah. I mean, our stunt coordinator was also the action unit director, Rob Alonzo, and he worked real closely with Dominic Toohey, who I think you've worked with on some projects, the special effects supervisor. And Dom, he went out of his way to build rigs to kind of do everything that we had, like a shipping container on the back of a truck that needed to turn over, and then it needed to crash into the ground, and then needed to spin around. And you couldn't do that all with one thing, so he built a number of different rigs. Like a drivable spinning container. He built one that tipped over, one that would you could drop a piece off, and so that stuff was, again, this is like that case where that foundation was incredibly helpful. And then we would often go in and we might use a portion of the photography, but because the spinning needed to have closer contact with the ground, or we needed to get more sparks off of it, or we just need to increase the speed, we'd end up using his special effects rigs as a foundation, and then effectively replacing a good chunk of it to add on to. And that was kind of the approach for the whole thing. They shot that sequence out, I want to say it was about 2 weeks plus a little bit they did a lot of testing early on. And, one of the things that Matt really embraced was the idea of telling as much of the story through hard mounts. Like he, in general, he's a very not POV, but like he embraces those seeing the action from subjective points of view. Like he wants you to experience the event, from the point of view of Batman or from the point of view of the Penguin as he's fleeing, and you'll jump between those perspectives depending on what part of the story is being told at that point. But he's not so into big, wide, or even we did use the Russian arm a little bit, but he really wanted to tell a lot of it through hard mounts. And so a lot of those that methodology of attaching cameras to the vehicles, there was a lot of testing and rigging that was done ahead of time, but all added up to about 2 weeks where we were shooting the whole thing. We looked at a lot of reference from the opening sequence of Taxi Driver, actually. Some of the shots of the taxi cruising through the night, and the light, the way the light changed off the water in droplets on the fenders of the car. And there are elements of that are effectively kind of like direct riffs on that theme in the chase as well, which is pretty fun.
But a lot of those car shots, I believe you did stationary on stage, so all the motion is actually something that you added.
Yeah, that's true. For a lot of what we would call kind of process shots, Dom had something he called the XY rig, which was a rig where you could put one car on a track that went forward and back, and another car on a track that went sideways. And by virtue of doing that, and then having the camera attached or moving wherever it might be, get that sense of like the cars catching up to one another or pulling away or smashing into one another. And that was quite effective for the stuff where we were going to see the actors, faces, where they were going to be doing some of their reactions and the big acting moments. We had pre-shot runs of our, effectively the chase path with an array rig, and then stitched them together into a kind of 360-degree playable, background that could whiz by, and we projected that onto some LED screens as well that were providing some of that lighting and that reflection off the windscreen and the rest of it. And that was reasonably effective. It's not quite the same thing as actually being there though. And that was one of the other things that was super helpful is we had Dom had built a number of cars, and some of the cars were rigged to be drivable from pods on the roof. So you could have I'm sure you guys have worked with that before, but you effectively have the stunt driver sitting on the roof, driving the car, and then the actor inside the car who is following along with the moving steering wheel, but doesn't have to focus on keeping the car safe. And we had some of the best, like ex-rally champion drivers driving the Batmobile around the course. And, it looked like they were doing, full power slides and 360-degree spin outs and things. And it was, and meanwhile you have your, Rob Pattinson sitting in the driver's seat, and he can do what he needs to do there. It was quite impressive what that vehicle could do. And that was one of the things that Matt was really insistent on in the design of the Batmobile. And James Chinlin, our production designer, leaned into, was like basing it off of a, more of like a muscle car rather than a fantasy kind of, concoction, something that could really perform. And Dom and his team ended up building a vehicle that was, I guess we ended up building about 4 of them. And they each had kind of a different purpose. Some of them were, there was one that was electric, so it was very quiet and had a fully fleshed out interior, and we used that for a lot of those interior shots. But then, there was one that had been stripped down and had extra long suspension. So the shot where the Batmobile, flies through the wall of fire and then comes and lands down close to camera, that one was actually mostly practical. We did a little bit of cleanup of, propane tanks and that kind of thing. But it was able to, ended up dropping, 12 feet and soared about 100 feet through the air before it touched down. It was pretty impressive. The methodology, there was like, we'd shoot everything that we could shoot. We did a lot of stuff on the process stage as well. And then where we needed to speed things up or do things that where we couldn't do things safely, we do the closest that we could, and then use that as reference and replace it with digital versions.
Was there ever any discussion of using models in any way?
Not so much for that stuff. I think for the Batman, there wasn't really a place where we felt like models would buy us more than actual physical buildings in the case of Gotham, or physical cars in the case of like the chase. We did use quite extensively LED walls to for some of the scenes, and that in particular for the scenes that were up on the unfinished skyscraper, both with Batman and Gordon, and then also later with Batman and Selina. And that was, we built a partial set and then surrounded it with a wall of LEDs that wrapped around, and then had I want to say it was about 5 different versions of Gotham that we put up on those walls, whether it was at night or at sunset or sunrise.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I guess, that it's a tool that Greg was a big advocate for. He'd used it in the past on Mandalorian and a couple other things. We were very kind of targeted in how we used it. It's something that I think is really effective for some things, and then for other things, you end up compromising. Like I think it's great for golden hour type shoots. All the stuff with Batman and Selina at dawn, as the sun's rising, and you get all that beautiful reflection of the warm sunlight and the cool sky off their black leather on their suits. That's stuff that would be really, next to impossible to do if we shot that on like a blue screen stage or something like that. That just the richness of
Can I ask? Yeah, can I ask though? What would be a variation on that? Would be to do a painted backing, that had all that quality that you would replace afterwards instead of doing blue screen. What would be the downside of doing something like that?
Of doing a painted backing?
Yeah, the fact that the LED wall is actually lighting the set, though, isn't it?
It is, yeah. You're getting all the light off the reflection of the puddles and the steel beams and, all of that stuff. And I think with the painted backing, and we actually did use a number of printed backings in Batman as well. Like one of the early fights in I would call it the opening kind of section was on a subway platform, and that had a printed backing that had, a few bits of light that we punched through, and it was painted, on both the front and the back, and we were, lighting it from the front and then popping some extra contrast through from the back as well. And it was effective to a point, but it's difficult to get the full contrast range. That like you're just a little bit limited in the amount of light that that can push out. And you are with the LEDs as well. Like that, what they do really well is color contrast, like something like a sunset where you've got warm and cool in the same environment. Like daylight, like with hard sunlight. Suddenly, the LEDs can't get that bright, and you've got to try to punch another, harder source through the volume and pop holes and do other tricks like that. And it's interesting. There are certain limitations in working in that space as well, in terms of like being able to get your camera far enough back for big wide shots. You're kind of now enclosed in the in a space by a wall, and so if you want to get a big wide, you either have to we actually lifted a section of wall. Do some of that, but it comes along with time and expense to do that. And the other thing is this is something I hadn't realized until we got into it, but it creates real headaches for sound as well. You've effectively got this parabolic surface that's pushing all that sound back onto the stage. And so we were out there with our sound recorder was had horsehair mats everywhere. Stuart, yeah. And we had these shower curtains hanging in front of the screens where they were off camera to try to help baffle some of that sound as well. And it was, it worked out all right, but there's just, additional headaches that go, and then you're sort of constrained within even a tighter space than what you would normally be on a stage anyway. And it's, and they're expensive. I think the biggest thing though is you have to embrace creating all of that content before in pre-production. And that's just a huge scheduling and logistical challenge. But also it requires a commitment on the part of the filmmakers and on the part of the studio to be like, okay, this is what we're doing. We're going to put it up on the wall and shoot it. And if, in order for it to make financial sense, you want to be able to get at least a certain percentage of those shots as in-camera finals, so that you're sort of barely touching them in visual effects, and that can be a huge win, but only if you have the commitment to what you've created. And it's so it's tough in prep to have enough time to put all that stuff together in a way that really works well. And so I think a lot of these projects you'll see they'll get a certain percentage of it finished to a certain level, and often they'll go back in and they'll use it as interactive lighting, but then to try to get an in-camera final ends up being a difficult thing. And so you'll have effectively green pixels right behind the actors, knowing that you're going to end up changing some things later, and use it as just a really big interactive light source, but something that maybe doesn't exercise all the potential that the tool can offer if you're a little bit more, if you have time to prepare adequately.
Wow.
Pretty much if you start with a certain number of visual effects, you must know going into it, it's going to probably double, right? By the end.
Yeah, it's...
that's what I've seen.
It is certainly often the case. I don't know. I've noticed in the last, 3 or 4 years, though, that, there are, teams and studios that have been quite a bit more buttoned down in that respect. And, there'll be a number and you have to hit that number in terms of your shot count and in terms of, your budget. And you're like, okay. But, if there's just, a little bit more, nope, that's the number. Hit the number. I feel like... time, I don't know, we're in a slightly different period than we were even 5 years ago, where that kind of growth in scope was kind of just expected, and you'd almost budget for it in a way.
But you kind of also have to deliver it, though. I mean, in the end, it's your work that's up there, and if another shot needs to be done to make the sequence work, it's even if they're not going to pay you extra for it, it's against your interest not to do it in a terrible way, right? Yeah,
and I guess you're just always trying to make sure that you're fighting the right fights, and that you've got, you're servicing the film in the best way possible, and not wasting. And anything that feels like it might change, having those conversations early with the editors and with the director about okay, this feels a little... it might alter. So we're going to put these shots on hold so that we can spend that money on other things as, the cut shakes out or whatever it is.
And are you always looking for, when they come to you and say, okay, we'll do visual effects in this particular section, are you looking and saying, well, wait, you could do this live? I mean, are you trying to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I often feel like I'm the person in the room that hates visual effects the most. When we're having these pre-production meetings, and you can do this. Oh gosh, I would not recommend that I do that. I think it's going to look much better if we could actually shoot the thing for real, or if we could at least start from and you have those kind of negotiation conversations where I'm actually trying to talk, reduce my scope a bit, but not because I don't want to do the work, but just because I think it's going to look better. Because this is the reality. It's it is, despite of all the advances in technology, it's still hard to make some things look completely plausible, completely real. And at least starting from a real foundation, you're just always going to be that much further ahead. And I guess, it comes down to the requirements of the filmmakers and the requirements of the project as well. And this is one of the things, I guess, that's been a learning curve for me over the years, is that not every, filmmakers have different sensibilities. And I listened to your podcast with Matt Reeves the other day, and I remember he was telling you a story about when some of the first shots that we were looking of apes in the forest in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, the first film that he directed, and Michael Saracen had, shot Andy Serkis out standing in the woods, and we had him in full mocap gear, and we had all the mocap system around him. we got those shots back into production and started replacing Andy with a Caesar, the chimpanzee, and we were using really good lighting reference from what Michael had shot, and through I guess a certain amount of like coercion, we had been encouraged by one of our creative directors to add an eye light because that's what we had done on some previous movies that had been requested. Every shot we had to add an eye light to get the eyes to pop, and so we under instruction from the creative directors added that eye light. And when Matt saw it, he was like, "What have you done? Like that's not what Michael shot." Like I look at Andy and I see mystery and I see like you don't know what he's thinking, and suddenly you filled his face in, and when he was telling you this story, I felt really bad actually. I was like, "Oh my gosh, Matt, I know, I'm so sorry. Like I didn't want to, but I had to." And
in the old days, sometimes our actress would insist on an eye light. It would have been nice to have had a director next to you that understood why or why not. Wanted an eye light. Anyway.
Yeah. But it was funny because, like, in the same film, we did one of the last shots of the movie was pushing into Caesar's eyes at like seeing him at the bottom of the skyscraper, and the shot pushes in. And the reference that Matt was using was from The Godfather. The opening shot where you've got that pinprick of light in the actor's eyes as you're pulling out. And so we were sort of riffing on that. So there's definitely an eye light in that shot, but it was a considered deliberate choice rather than just chuck it in there because that's what we always do.
All right. Can you talk about how creature animations changed? I mean, I presume in the last Planet of the Apes, you didn't have anybody dressed in costume like in the Charlton Heston version of Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the changes and how much now does, obviously motion capture, but how much does AI enter into the equation these days?
Yeah, that's a good question. We definitely, like, when I first started talking to the, Fox, the studio, about the Planet of the Apes movie, we just finished Avatar, where we'd done a ton of motion capture. We called it performance capture because in addition to the motion, we also had cameras on the actors' faces. We were recording all the nuance of their face. And in talking to Fox, we were pitching this idea that, like, okay, look, we can do the same thing, but we're going to do it on location. So we can go out, we can go into the woods in Vancouver, or take it onto an urban set, anywhere really, and set up a motion capture space where we can capture the actors doing their performance, and then replace them with apes. And so that was kind of a new bleeding edge technology. I mean, while we were shooting the first one, it was a little nerve-wracking. I was biting my nails a little bit. We, our technicians were literally soldering LEDs together on the side of the set, like with speaker wire and LEDs that they ordered, and like putting them into packs. And it was all pretty. It was going to work, but it was just a matter. It was a little fragile at that point, and a little on the bleeding edge. We had replaced, on a traditional mocap stage, you'll have these little balls, they're kind of wrapped in Scotch-Brite, so if you shine a light at them, it shines back at you. And those little balls get Velcroed onto the actor's body. And then you have all these cameras around them, these special motion capture cameras that shine invisible infrared light onto the actor, and it bounces off the balls back to the cameras, and the computer system can figure out where all the balls are. And then you can attach a skeleton of the creature to the movement of the actor. And you try to do that outside, and suddenly the sunlight is just too bright. It overpowers the little cameras. And so instead of having the light on the cameras, we decided to attach the light to the actors' bodies. And so that was the big kind of change there. We call them active markers because the markers are actively shooting light out from them. Mm-hmm. And doing that on location was like kind of the big game changer. We could actually shoot in sunlight and it would be okay. We would be able to get the data that we needed. And so that process was all geared around being able to capture the actors, doing the performance. And so rather than animators, shooting a plate and then animators coming in after the fact and, designing the motion and basically doing the storytelling sometime in post. We could use a kind of more traditional filmmaking process, have the director look through the camera, tell the actor what to do, the actor to have that kind of normal collaborative conversation that actors and directors and cinematographers as well can all participate in the camera movement, the timing of the actors hitting their marks, delivering the performance, and then the director kind of guiding everything. And so it ends up being a lot more like making a traditional movie, but you just have to make that leap of faith that eventually that actor is going to look like a chimpanzee. And it's funny because like even in the temp screenings for audiences, you take that leap of faith, that suspension of disbelief, kind of within the first 5 minutes. You can watch the edit. Like the way we would edit those films would be like just the actors in their funny looking gray pajamas with all the dots on them. And you cut the whole movie together that way, master, medium, close-ups. And you just kind of accept that like they're going to be, you connect to like, especially when you've got somebody like Andy Serkis, who is such a wonderful actor, you engage with him emotionally, and his face and his choices, everything is there. And you just accept, it's like watching theater or something. Eventually, he'll look like a monkey, but for right now, you don't care because you're just so emotionally engaged in his performance. And so that was kind of the template of making those movies, was like use actors, get a performance, and then go back, cut it all together, and replace the actors with the monkeys, basically. And with Matt in particular, he was such a he worked so hard with the actors to get those performances. We weren't going to change a muscle on on the chimpanzees that wasn't happening on Andy. And it's there are scenes in the movie where Caesar cries. Like Caesar doesn't shed a tear that Andy Serkis didn't shed first. Like it was we were that kind of dialed into the performances and what the actors were doing in terms of matching it with the digital chimpanzees in the end. Yeah, so that was the kind of process for those films, and I think having that that performance-driven process really it makes a huge difference to like how those films look and feel and how people can connect to them emotionally. Like in terms of the question about like what AI tools we're using. I mean, like I wouldn't say that we're using we have used machine learning to do things like better map the actors' facial performances onto a digital character so that there's less. It just becomes faster, and there's fewer mistakes made in terms of interpreting like when the actor like smiles, like which muscles are firing. Mm-hmm. The machine learning tools are pretty good at like teasing that apart and being like, okay, it's 60% of like the corner puller and 80% of the cheek raiser, and that kind of thing that in the past had taken a lot of manual labor to get that to work. The machine learning tools are pretty good at like helping to accelerate that, but it still requires skilled artists, and it still is faithful to the performance that the actor gave in the first place. It's not taking anybody's job per se. It's just helping the artists do a faster, more efficient process.
I'm wondering why you even need the markers anymore, though. Surely, if you've got 3 cameras capturing a performance, AI can translate that into a perfect 3D interpretation, can't it? Why do you need motion capture lights
all the dots
markers?
And everything? Yeah, there are tools that are starting to move away from some of that. Yeah, so and it's just a question of, I think, precision and efficiency, and then also process. Like a lot of times, it's a hassle to like have to put up the dots in everybody's face, and sometimes it can be distracting for people. And I think the more that we can make the tools friendly and accommodating to the other participants in the process, the better the final result is going to be.
Wow, this has been really interesting. Yeah.
I guess the other thing I was going to mention is just how when you work with a team or with filmmakers for a certain amount of time, you sort of develop a shorthand. You get into certain rhythms, and you you kind of know what to expect, in a given scene or in a scenario. It's funny, like so much of my career has been based on like trying to make things look real, or at least, if not real, at least credible, to make it feel like that thing could really exist, could be there. And then sometimes you find yourself in a different kind of project where like realism isn't necessarily the goal. You have to kind of open your ears up again and listen to the filmmakers and what they're trying to achieve. And it might not be verisimilitude. It might be, something that has, a lot more theatricality. And it's funny. It's certain things that you take for granted, after doing a few projects, and then suddenly you realize that you've made the wrong step because you just assumed that everybody wanted things to, look real or to look gritty or dirty, and something like, oh no, that's not this film. You've got to back up and begin.
Yeah. Do you think, in a way, there's an obsession with some things looking totally naturalistic, where, like you said, you're watching the rough cut of actors with motion capture lights or marks all over them, and it still works because the sense you actually kind of start to believe it because the actual drama is so strong and the content so strong. And that was kind of my implication about the first Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston and people in ape costumes. You can watch that film and you just forget about the ape costumes because it's so strong and what the film is saying. And, you enter that world just as you enter the world of Jason of the Argonauts with these like skeletons that, it's very old technology, but the strength of the performance and the material takes you into another world, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think they did a theatrical performance of the Elephant Man, and I think they used David Bowie or something, and they didn't have any makeup or anything. And so here's this beautiful person playing this crippled guy, but by the end of the production, you believe that's what you saw. And I think that's what the magic of movies is.
Yeah, I think it's not just in effects. I think in the lighting and everything's become so, we want it naturalistic. So, but whereas the sort of like the 50s sort of noirish kind of look of lighting and the graphic design, where's that gone? It's a shame, really.
Yeah, and emotionally too, like there are great films that like really project, like emotionally as well, like where the actors just go for it. And then like musicals, you'll get people literally singing their feelings out loud, and it's it doesn't, it's not something that happens a lot in my day-to-day experience, but in the magic of the theater, you're like, oh yeah, I connect with that feeling, and that the feeling is more important than like the realism. And like I'm thinking of a film like Everything Everywhere All at Once, where like famously the effects were relatively lo-fi, like and some of it like intentionally, you're seeing the rough edges. And yet, in the context of that film, it's so much fun and it's so wacky and different that like it completely works. It's completely It's not your suspension of disbelief. As long as like I feel like if you obey the rules that you've established within the first 10 minutes of the film, if you're consistent, then you can kind of get away with just about anything. Whether the economic forces will let you do that or not is another story. But those special films that are able to really lean into their theatricality, I think they can be really magical.
Yeah. Well, what was the monster movie in New York that was all shot on a kind of low-end camera?
Oh, Cloverfield.
That
was Matt, wasn't it?
It was Matt,
Which it's a magical piece of work,
it's so good.
But
it's such a great concept and so well executed.
Yeah.
So are you? That's it now. You're wetter in New Zealand. You've got into New Zealand life, have you?
Yeah, I'm actually working for Warner Brothers directly. I'm like, but I'm working with Weta, and I'm working with a company called ImageWorks in Canada. I'm actually at Park Road Post while we speak, which is Peter Jackson's post-production facility,
Ah.
and we're operating out of there and doing our post from New Zealand on this one. I'm working on a Minecraft movie right now, that's keeping me
All right.
busy.
Wow.
Yeah, whole different
Very
kind
good.
of take. How to adapt
Yeah.
a low fidelity video game that the world has fallen in love with into a cinematic experience. It's a tricky one.
All right. Well,
good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Lovely talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so
Such a
much
pleasure.
for this.
Yeah, really
Yeah.
appreciate you guys taking the time to chat.
It was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.